Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I apologize for the inclement weather. Of course, it was not my fault, but I was unable to get out my car because of the flooding, and the water was horrible. And I talked to Ms. Cochran. Ms. Cochran said this would be a great idea. I've done it for my online classes at the other college where I work, and it seems to work out really well. I don't want to waste any instruction time, so I'm going to go ahead and start with a highlights of Chapter 9. We're going to talk about what the country was like after the ratification of the United States Constitution. So we're looking at right now the 1792 election results. There were 16 states by that time in the Union. George Washington won by an overwhelming majority of 97.8%, and in second place was John Adams. Back then, when you were in a presidential election and you finished second, you became the vice president. It's not like it is today where you have two tickets running and people just, they get on the ticket and they get elected, vice presidents, who they choose their running mate. So back then, it was the person that finished in second. Well, John Adams would succeed Washington after Washington left office in 1799. Excuse me. He left office in 1799, and John Adams, because he didn't want to serve another term, John Adams became the second president of the United States. And then if you look a little further down on the list, you see Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson became the third president of the United States. Now, at one time, Jefferson and Adams were very, very close, but they had developed a very nasty rivalry because one was a Federalist, another one was a Democratic Republican. So we start to see them become virtual enemies. And in fact, when they both died on July 4th, 1826, which was exactly 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson died first, and I believe John Adams died second, not too far behind each other. But I kind of thought it was ironic to see them actually die on the same day, 50 years exactly from the time they signed the Declaration of Independence. Washington Irving was a great writer in our early nation's history, and he came up with a term called cultural nationalism. Now, nationalism is a term that means people that have an extreme love of country. So when we look at nationalism, we look at, a nation that is basically a baby. It was an experiment. We had just ratified our Constitution. Of course, it's not perfect. Things are going to happen to where we actually, you got to crawl before you walk. And we see this cultural nationalism that occurred at the time of right after the ratification of the Constitution. We would undergo some religious movements. There was deism, and there was the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening occurred as a result of what was going on in the United States, where people praised God for the blessing of a nation, even though the institution of slavery had still existed. The Second Great Awakening was, it was this is a picture of a revivalist meeting. And what happened was preachers used to go around to different cities, set up a tent, and people would go in and they would sing and praise God. There were a lot of people that these were true believers. Charles G. Finney, the ranges of tents and the fires reflecting light, the candles and lamps illuminating the encampment, hundreds to and fro, the preaching, praying, singing, and shouting like the sound. Let me get my picture out of there for a second. You can see it. Okay. Like the sound of many waters was enough to swallow up all the powers of contemplation. It was a soul shaking conversion. People were actually worshiping God, and they were speaking in tongues and things of that nature. It's founded in 1816, and if you look at it, it'll demonstrate how many people belonged to different religions at the time. Well, religion was a mainstay. Our country was founded on Judeo-Christian principles, including the Ten Commandments. If you read the Ten Commandments are, the laws are stemming from that. Thou shalt not kill. There's laws against murder. Thou shalt not steal. There's laws against theft. Adultery became a a foundation for basically divorce. Although it was against God's law, it was not illegal, but you could still get a divorce because of it. There was also an economic nationalism, and that economic nationalism encouraged creativity and inventiveness, create a transportation infrastructure, and create a pro-business type of atmosphere. Now, Jefferson's vision of America had to do with agrarian agriculture, but he also believed in a term called laissez-faire. And laissez-faire means let it be, basically in French. You let these businesses and the economy do what it's supposed to do, what it's designed to do, and people would wind up, businesses would grow without government regulation. Now, in 1794, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. He was credited with it, but it was actually invented by a slave. Now, what the cotton gin does is you put cotton in it and reduces the seeds. So what happens with the invention of the cotton gin, sadly, is that slavery becomes more profitable in the South because it can produce more cotton. So if they get slaves out there to pick the cotton, they can take the seeds out, and the cotton would be very profitable. Not a good thing as far as slavery is concerned, but it increased a lot of slaveholders to buy more slaves so they could pick more cotton on the plantations. Also, Whitney had a gun factory. Now, what he does with interchangeable parts is each weapon used to be made by hand, and it was made singly. So if it broke down, you had to send it to a gunsmith, and they had to fix it like that. Well, if you have interchangeable parts for weapons, it makes it a lot easier to fix. You make the parts available, and you don't have to spend a fortune fixing the weapon. So Whitney also contributed to interchangeable parts, which actually became something of an assembly line in the 19th century, early 19th century America. The first turnpike was located in Lancaster, Pennsylvania in 1790. Let me get my picture away from there. By 1832, clearly 2,400 miles of road were connected to most major cities. So you see, with the new government, we had road infrastructure. We had a lot of infrastructure. We could build roads that were more passable. It wasn't just hacking through the wilderness in order to get somewhere. And the government worked to help this infrastructure. Now, what we see here is the Cumberland National Road, and if it was in 1811, and the Cumberland National Road actually went to make the nation smaller. If you build roads, make it easily accessible. And I'll give you, for instance, if you look at the internet per se, the internet can be seen as a road because it makes the world smaller. We can send emails in a split second. We can send texts in a split second. That all evolved from the internet. One of the biggest inventions was called the Conestoga Covered wagons. And what happens with these covered wagons is it allows you to travel greater distances. You could put kitchens in these things, and people could travel from virtually from East Coast to West Coast. And we see a lot of these in the Oregon Trail when it opens up. A lot of families are moving out west to make their fortunes or to seek a better life. Now, also, sea travel was a lot better because we had more sails. Remember, we talked about the lateen sail. It become standard equipment on ships. The Yankee Clipper ships had more sails, which means it was faster. They called them Yankee Clippers. And they were able to transport goods faster for profits. Robert Fulton developed the steamboat in 1807, and the steamboat basically used a steam engine to paddle a turbine, which turned a paddle, which allowed river travel to become faster as well. You got to remember something, that necessity is the mother of invention. And also, for every invention, there is a military application. I think we discussed that before. If we look at the Erie Canal system, what the Erie Canal system was, it was built to go from Lake Erie all the way to Vermont. Now, what this does is it gives you a passageway for goods to travel from the inner continent to get to ships that are headed out to sea. The Mississippi River served as one of those outlets as well. The Erie Canal was completed in 1820, and what happens is you have two mules on either side that are pulling the shipment through the canal to get it through there faster, until the steam-powered engine actually made it a little bit more economical and a little bit more profitable. In the 1796 election, John Adams actually was elected president, and Thomas Jefferson became the vice president. I'm sorry, George Washington did not serve 2 terms; he served 1. And we see Samuel Adams, who was down in the end of the list, who actually defended those soldiers in Massachusetts during the Boston Massacre. So now we see this 26 years later. You also see Thomas Pinckney. Aaron Burr would later become vice president, and he would kill Alexander Hamilton in a duel, be wanted by the authorities. George Clinton was a great politician from the state of New York. So you start to see some familiar names in this. Now on the next slide, we're seeing the election results, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Let's go back a little bit and see. It wasn't so much of a landslide as it was when Washington was elected. In the 1800 election results, we see Thomas Jefferson barely winning over, actually it was a tie between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, and it had to be thrown into the House of Representatives, but Thomas Jefferson became the President of the United States. Let me see if I can get through here. So Thomas Jefferson, actually, you get 1 vote for each state. If you look here, you'll see the election results was thrown into the House of Representatives. Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican, won by 62%, and Aaron Burr finished second by 25%, and he would become the vice president. In those days, that's what happens. If you have a tie, it gets thrown into the House of Representatives. Now, in early we had an early culture, and we will cover that a little bit later. Again, we see through cultural nationalism, we see the virtuous citizen and the American English form of the Noah Webster Dictionary. We see that come out. Now, what I wanted to point out to you was that in your book, it talks about the Constitution and commerce, and it also goes into the subject of suffrage. Now, what is suffrage? Suffrage is when you give people the right to vote. And that is very important, because when the Constitution was written, only adult white males at the age of 21 who owned land could vote. And we also start to see this principle spread to other parts of the world as well. If you look at France, after the United States, France had a revolution where they got rid of their monarch. And how did the revolution spread there? Well, in actuality, the principles that are in the Constitution had come to light through Thomas Jefferson with the philosophes. These were people during the Enlightenment period that we discussed. John Locke, Baron Montesquieu, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who came up with the social contract theory. So how did it spread to France? Well, the French soldiers that had been fighting with the Americans against the British in America actually took it back to France and said, you know, democracy doesn't sound like a bad idea. Why don't we try it here? And it started to spread. Unfortunately, the French Revolution overturned the monarchy, but would eventually lead to Napoleon Bonaparte coming into power in Europe. and in France, and he would eventually become a dictator. He would build the French Empire. He would have had near the end of his reign in 1814, 1815, he would later lose at the Battle of Waterloo in Belgium in 1815, and he would lose power. He would fall from power, and he eventually died in 1821 on an island. I believe it was the island of Elba. No, I'm sorry. It was. Oh, it escapes me right now. But he died on an island. Allegedly, he was poisoned because when you look at pictures of him later, he has a distended stomach. But the French Revolution was very important because it overthrew the monarchy in France. And one of the things I wanted to point out to you was in 1796 when, Washington left office. In his farewell address, he started talking about the neutrality of the United States. We must remain neutral because if we get involved in foreign entanglements, it will be very difficult for the United States. And it was. We tried to stay out of foreign entanglements. By 1803, we had become embroiled in a war against the Muslim Barbary pirates. That was the first war that we won against them. As far as the government was concerned and in the Supreme Court, there was a case that came to light called Marbury versus Madison. And what happened was, during the course of this case, a gentleman by the name of Marbury was not appointed to a circuit court, and he filed a lawsuit. It's very important that you understand Marbury versus Madison because it establishes the principle of judicial review. Now, what your book says in judicial review, which means that any case that is tried within the United States needs to be heard by the United States Supreme Court. And that is important because especially when we deal with cases involving the particular different agencies in the United States, it's very important that we understand it. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave you here. I just covered the highlights of Chapter 9. You need to start reading Chapter 9. And Wednesday, hopefully the weather won't be bad, I'll be able to come back and actually do a lecture on the United States in the second half of the Adams administration and the beginning of the Jefferson administration when we talk about the Louisiana Purchase. So I'm going to put this up on YouTube so that you could get a look at it. I was just giving you the highlights of what was going on, and I'll see you Wednesday, okay?